I'm Dr. Loren M. Hill, and this is the Strategist Is In, where we examine the systems shaping high achievement and how to navigate them with clarity. We'd like to believe that there's a level where it actually gets easier, right? A title that lets you exhale, a role that you finally stop having to prove yourself in. And we've heard a lot of conversations about that, I think, lately, where women and people have said time and time again, wow, I thought, playing by the rules would get me certain places, or just proving myself would be good enough. And that hasn't always been the case. And so what if, the higher the level and the higher the influence, the heavier the expectation? So this season has been about the emotional cost of excellence. And today we're looking at what the cost looks like at the top. So recently I was at a gathering with a group of individuals who many would sort of describe as movers and shakers. These are women and people with a lot of influence, people with authority. Essentially, when decisions are made by them, not only do they ripple throughout the organization, but they ripple outward. So it could be the community, it could be a broader reach. And it was a serious room, focused, strategic, high level. Everybody, I have to say, who was there was on their A game. The other great thing about this was truly a safe space. And so as the meeting went on, one of the participants said something that kind of stopped me cold. She was talking about her position and things that she's responsible for. And she said, at the end of the day, I feel like I've been rolling a boulder uphill. Now, it wasn't dramatic. She wasn't complaining. It was almost like, analytic and sort of reflective. And then she added, at the end of the day, she feels exhausted, not just tired, exhausted. So this wasn't somebody who was early in their career. It wasn't someone who was still trying to prove herself. And it clearly wasn't someone without resources, right? Like I said, these are C-suite individuals. These are people who are entrepreneurs. And I should also say that these were all women, or those who identified as women. And so she is something at the top structurally in her organization, in her community, as were the others that were in the room. And so when she said boulder, something in me clicked. I thought about Sisyphus. So you all know I talk about Sisyphus, but if you're new to the show or you need a refreshment, in Greek mythology, Sisyphus is condemned to push a massive boulder up the hill. Every time he reaches the top, it rolls back down and he has to start again. I have often thought that myth is a metaphor for really early career striving, for climbing, for proving. But here it was again, at the top again. And so something that has really kind of been stirring it with me around this is that it appears that this happens throughout life, not just in the beginning of your career or as you're trying to develop yourself. We all have these sort of metaphoric boulders, right? So here is at the room, high power women, and she's at the top of her game and she's talking about this. So my internal reaction surprised me a little bit, but it caused me to think deeper. So when she said boulder, I didn't think she was talking about a weakness, or that she was feeling, some type of fragility or something like that. What I thought about more deeply is the structure, right? So I heard a system that requires daily proving, I heard a design where effort resets instead of accumulates. I heard expectations that expand faster than support. And again, it wasn't about fragility, it is about architecture. And that realization reframed the entire conversation for me and kind of sparked the way we're going with this episode today. So we're often taught to believe that there's a point of a right? There's a level where it gets easier, where perhaps the title you have allows you to exhale. There's a position where you no longer have to prove yourself. And we imagine a hierarchy of relief, right? So the more you get to the top, the probably the less of the strain it will be. So if we get to the next level, then the pressure will ease, right? But that's not what I've been hearing, nor has it been what I experienced myself, right? So, what if the higher the influence, the heavier the expectation? Hmm, right? So, think about this: influence increases visibility, visibility increases elevation, elevation increases internal pressure to maintain confidence. So excellence at lower levels is often, about performance, right? But excellence at higher levels becomes about stabilization, judgment, and constant recalibration. So the boulder doesn't disappear, it actually changes form. So let's be precise. So expectation is not inherently harmful. In fact, research in organizational psychology, I don't want to shorten it, distinguishes between challenge stressors and hindrance stressors, right? So challenge stressors are responsibility, complexity, meaningful urgency. These can increase engagement when individuals perceive them as aligned and controllable, right? So, some of us do well under pressure when it's in these categories. But hindrance stressors are things like bureaucracy, political friction. And then that could just be, like politics of the institution. How do you figure that all out when it's changing all the time? Unclear authority. You thought you were doing one thing, or your job says this, but you actually have to do something. Constant rejustification of like, why are you doing that? Well, I thought I was given the authority to do that. So all of these things, plus others, really drain our energy. So hopefully that provides a bit of a context between a challenge stressor and a hindrance stressor. So again, when we think about this concept of the boulder is not responsibility itself. I like to sort of think about this and frame it as perhaps it's the friction, right? Having to move this thing in ways in which it doesn't actually move at all, right? Or in fact, it can roll back down on you. Or maybe it's just the slightest little move forward and then a lot backwards. So it's the tension and the friction between those things, right? And then it could also be the constant reset, right? So perhaps it's the sense that yesterday's excellence doesn't bite today's ease. As you listen, I'd like you to quietly consider, where in your life does effort accumulate? Where does it feel like you're starting over each morning? Just notice, no fixing. Now, there's another layer, and leadership often means becoming a reference point, right? It's the person others look to or towards, right? The one whose reaction sets the tone, one who absorbs the tension in the room. Even when you are navigating uncertainty yourself, right? All eyes are on you. And competence, once demonstrated consistently, becomes expected. So, hey, I'll just say that it's my opinion, and it might be shared by some, that many of us exceed competence, right? We are excellent already. And so when we come in and we're doing that and it's expected and we are excelling, right? That is a baseline. So if our baseline is excellent and others are fairly competent, then we become hyper visible and invisible at the same time because what we're doing doesn't get any extra recognition. So I'll leave that there for a moment to see if it resonates. And we'll probably delve into that in the future. But again, if this is what you're doing, if you are excellent at what you're doing every day and that is your baseline and it is invisible, then recognition either doesn't happen or it plateaus at a certain point, and the expectation of what you have to do expands because it's like, oh, well, she can do that with her eyes closed. There was a very famous actress and performer, singer, dancer, back in the day, who was saying, hey, I had to do everything that my dance partner did backwards and in high heels. So some of you may be familiar with that, but it's true, right? So if you come in doing it all smooth, guess what? Labor continues. You probably are going to get more of it. You're going to get less recognition, and then expectations expand, particularly when you are in a leadership position, right? So, if you're someone others look to, I would invite you to consider a couple of things. What expectations have you internalized that no one explicitly assigned to you? This is a question that I ask people all the time. And, we got to think about this. The next one is, what are you carrying because it feels like that is simply what leaders do? Now, I pose these two questions, and it really is not about blame, it's about awareness, right? So, as I was in that meeting listening, I realized how often I have assumed that reaching the next level would reduce the weight, that essentially competence would buy some comfort, the influence would soften the strain, and yet I keep hearing versions of this same metaphor from people across sectors in academia, in corporate leadership, in nonprofits, in entrepreneurship, and in community spaces. Frankly, some of the leadership roles are formally defined and then some of them are not. But many people I'm finding are quietly pushing. So, back to what I was saying earlier about stressors, let me just say this, like, not all leaders experience their roles as burdensome. I'm not, I don't want you all to think that. Again, some thrive under pressure. I know I do. Some experience high responsibility as energizing and deeply meaningful. And the research does support that nuance. particularly when demands align with values and when individuals have autonomy and clarity, and responsibility can function as fuel rather than friction. So the question is not whether leadership is inherently exhausting. The better question is, under what conditions does excellence feel like purpose? And under what conditions does it feel like punishment? Yeah, you see the difference there? So if the way you feel is structural rather than personal, what becomes possible? I think that question really shifts everything. It did for me, right? So, in the myth of Sisyphus, the tragedy is not the effort that he was putting into it, it was the reset, right? So, yes, I can push this up the hill. I got it, I got it. But then the reset is rolling down every time I push it up, right? So the fact that progress doesn't hold, many leaders are describing something similar: re-earning credibility, re-establishing authority, resolving variations of the same problem, re-explaining decisions. So if excellence evaporates overnight, believe me, the emotional cost truly compounds. The higher the influence, the heavier the expectation. This is what the emotional cost of excellence looks like when it reaches the top of the hierarchy. If even those at the top feel like they're pushing uphill each day, then resilience alone is not the answer. We really have to examine the hill. We have to examine how roles are designed, and we have to think of how expectations are distributed, how recovery is structured. If the weight is structural, then structural design becomes possible. And that is far more of an empowering place to begin than a self critique. So I'm still thinking about the calm way she said it: rolling a boulder, exhausted. No theatrics, just recognition. And I find myself wondering, what if leadership didn't require starting over every day? What if excellence accumulated instead of evaporated? Wow, I think that's kind of powerful. So, if season 5 has taught us anything, it's that the emotional cost of excellence doesn't disappear with achievement, it changes shape. And when we understand the shape, we can begin to redesign the system, not push harder inside it. So, if this conversation sparked something for you, I created a short reflection worksheet to help you map where your efforts accumulate and where it resets. You can download it free in the show notes. So, once again, I am Dr. Loren M. Hill. This has been The Strategist Is In. Thank you for joining us, and I will look forward to engaging with you again soon.